Before you embark upon this long journey through the winding streets of Buenos Aires, take a moment to settle into your surroundings. Ensure that your body is fully supported, feeling the weight of your limbs as they rest against the surface beneath you. Inhale deeply, pulling the cool, quiet air into your lungs, and exhale slowly, letting go of the day's residual noise. Imagine the world outside your window softening, the sharp edges of reality blurring into a gentle, charcoal haze. This narrative is crafted to move with the deliberate, unhurried pace of a river at dusk. There is no urgency here, only the steady rhythm of observation and the quiet pulse of a city breathing in the dark. As the story unfolds, allow the excessive details, the texture of the cobblestones, the scent of damp wool, the flicker of distant streetlights, to act as a tether, grounding you in a world of stillness. Your mind does not need to solve the puzzles presented, it only needs to drift through them, much like the protagonist drifts through the fog. Let the words wash over you, their cadence lulling you into a state of profound calm. We are entering a space where time stretches, where every shadow holds a story, and where the only requirement is to listen and fade into the velvet embrace of sleep. The humidity in Buenos Aires during the late autumn has a way of clinging to the skin like a damp, unwanted secret. It is a heavy, tactile presence that turns the air into a thick soup of salt, exhaust, and the faint, metallic tang of the Rio de la Plata. Arthur Pendergast, a man whose very existence seemed to have been sanded down by decades of bureaucratic friction in London, sat at a small, wobbling table in a café on the corner of Calle, Florida. He was a creature of the shadows, a man of gray suits and gray thoughts, sent by the Circus to overlook a transition that no one particularly wanted to acknowledge. Before him sat a cup of coffee that had long since grown cold, a thin skin of oil forming on its surface like a map of a forgotten territory. He watched the passers-by through the condensation-streaked window, his eyes, pale and watery, registering every flicker of movement without ever appearing to focus. The street was a river of silhouettes, businessmen in trench coats, students with scarves wrapped tightly against the damp, and the occasional street performer whose music was swallowed by the low growl of the city. Pendergast's task was ostensibly simple, the kind of mundane administrative oversight that the service used to bury its older, more frayed assets. He was to meet a contact known only as the Cartographer, a man who claimed to have the blueprints for a network of sleeper cells that had survived the collapse of the old regimes. But in the world of espionage, simplicity was a coat of paint over a crumbling wall. Every interaction was a layer of deception, a meticulously constructed lie designed to protect a core of truth that was often too small and pathetic to matter. He adjusted his glasses, the bridge of his nose sore from the weight of the frames, and felt the familiar ache in his lower back. This was the reality of the trade, not the cinematic flare of gunfire or high-speed chases, but the soul-crushing boredom of waiting in drafty rooms, the endless consumption of bad coffee, and the constant, nagging suspicion that one's own side was just as likely to betray you as the enemy. The café, El Destino, was a cavernous space with high ceilings and peeling gold leaf on the cornices, a relic of a more opulent era that had been overtaken by the creeping rot of neglect. The waiters moved with a practiced, glacial indifference, their white jackets yellowed with age. Pendergast liked it here. It was a place where a man could disappear into the woodwork, where the very atmosphere encouraged silence. He thought of his small flat in Kensington, the stacks of unread journals, the silence that greeted him every evening. There was a comfort in that silence, a lack of expectation. Here, in the heart of a city that never seemed to fully wake up or fully go to sleep, he felt a strange kinship with the architecture. He was a monument to a war that had never truly ended, only changed its shape and its vocabulary. He checked his watch, a sturdy, silver Omega that had been a gift from a mentor who had long since passed away under dubious circumstances. It was 5:14 p.m. The cartographer was late, but lateness was a form of communication in this business. It was a test of nerves, a way to see if the mark would grow restless, if they would start looking at the door too often or tapping their fingers on the table. Pendergast did neither. He remained perfectly still, a statue in a gray suit, his mind wandering through the archives of his memory. He remembered Berlin in '68, the biting cold that felt like needles against the face, the sound of boots on gravel, and the sudden, sickening realization that the man he was supposed to extract had already been compromised. He remembered the look in the man's eyes, not fear, but a profound, weary resignation. It was a look Pendergast saw in the mirror every morning. The door of the cafe creaked open, admitting a gust of damp air and a tall, thin man wearing a fedora and a long, dark overcoat. The man scanned the room with a practiced, sweeping motion, his gaze lingering on the exit before settling on Pendergast. This was not the cartographer. This was someone else, a messenger perhaps, or a tale. Pendergast felt a slight tightening in his chest, the only physical manifestation of the adrenaline that used to surge through him in his younger days. Now, it was just a dull throb, a reminder that his heart was still beating. The man approached the table with a slow, deliberate stride, his footsteps muffled by the sawdust on the floor. He pulled out the chair opposite Pendergast without asking and sat down, placing a small, leather-bound notebook on the table between them. "The weather is unsuitable for walking," the man said in a low, gravelly voice. His Spanish was tinted with a thick, Eastern European accent, the vowels elongated and heavy. "The rain is a necessity for the garden," Pendergast replied, the prearranged code falling from his lips with the ease of a prayer. The man nodded, a sharp, bird-like movement. He removed his hat, revealing a head of thinning, silver hair and a forehead lined with the deep furrows of a life spent in the shadows. His eyes were dark, almost black, and they held a predatory sharpness that Pendergast found deeply unsettling. This was a man who had seen the worst of humanity and had likely contributed to it. They sat in silence for a long moment, the only sound the clatter of dishes from the kitchen and the distant hum of traffic. It was a standoff of sorts, a mutual assessment of value and threat. "I am told you are a man who appreciates the finer details," the man said, his fingers drumming a rhythmic tattoo on the leather cover of the notebook. "A man who understands that the map is not the territory, but it is all we have to navigate the dark. Details are the only thing that keep us from falling into the abyss," Pendergast said, his voice steady. "But maps can be forged. They can lead a man into a trap just as easily as they can lead him home." The man smiled, a thin, mirthless curving of the lips. "Home is a concept for those who do not live in the margins, Mr. Pendergast. For us, there is only the next station, the next contact, the next lie. You are here for the network. The ghosts of the southern cone. I am here for the truth of their existence," Pendergast corrected. "The circus is tired of chasing shadows. We want names, locations, and the sources of their funding. If they are truly as dormant as you claim, then we want to know who is holding the alarm clock." The man leaned forward, the scent of stale tobacco and cheap cologne wafting across the table. "The alarm clock is in many hands. Some of them are closer to you than you would like to believe. Buenos Aires is a city of layers. Underneath the tango and the steak houses, there is a labyrinth of old debts and older grudges. The men you seek are not hiding in the jungle. They are the men you pass on the street, the men who sell you your newspaper, the men who sit in the back of the theater and watch the world go by." He pushed the notebook toward Pendergast. "Inside, you will find a list of addresses. They are not the locations of the cells, but the locations of the memories. If you visit them, in the order I have written, you will begin to see the pattern. But be warned, the pattern is not a straight line. It is a spiral, and at the center of the spiral, there is only silence. Pendergast reached out and placed his hand on the notebook. It felt cold, the leather slick with the humidity of the room. He didn't open it. He knew better than to display curiosity in front of a source. Curiosity was a weakness, it showed that you were still invested in the outcome. And what is the price for this atlas of ghosts? The price has already been paid, the man said, rising from his chair. I am merely the delivery boy. Tell your masters in London that the debt is settled. Tell them that the cartographer has retired to a place where the maps are all blank. Without another word, the man turned and walked out of the café, disappearing into the gray mist of Calle, Florida. Pendergast sat alone, the notebook a heavy weight under his palm. He felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of exhaustion. The game was beginning again, the same tired moves on the same dusty board. He picked up his cup of coffee and took a sip. It was bitter, cold, and entirely devoid of comfort. He looked out at the street, at the people moving through the gloom, and wondered how many of them were part of the pattern, and how many were just silhouettes, waiting for the light to change. The first address in the notebook led him to a crumbling apartment block in San Telmo, a neighborhood where the history of the city seemed to leak out of the walls in the form of damp patches and peeling plaster. The building stood on a narrow street, its facade adorned with weathered caryatids whose faces had been erased by a century of urban decay. Pendergast walked slowly, his umbrella held low, his senses attuned to the rhythm of the neighborhood. He noticed the way the local shopkeeper watched him from behind a pile of bruised oranges, the way a group of teenagers fell silent as he passed, their eyes tracking his movement with a mixture of suspicion and boredom. This was the texture of the mission, the slow, methodical accumulation of observations that would eventually form a picture, or at least a convincing illusion of one. Inside the building, the air was thick with the smell of boiled cabbage and floor wax. The elevator was a birdcage of wrought iron that looked as though it hadn't moved since the 30s, so Pendergast took the stairs. His breath came in shallow, ragged bursts by the time he reached the 4th floor. He found the door he was looking for, number 4B, and knocked softly. There was no answer, only the sound of a television blaring a soap opera somewhere down the hall. He tried the handle, it was unlocked. He stepped inside, his hand instinctively reaching for the heavy, blunt object in his pocket, though he knew he wouldn't need it. The apartment was a tomb of a different kind. It was filled with books, thousands of them, stacked from floor to ceiling in a chaotic, dust-covered library. There were newspapers from decades ago, yellowed and brittle, and maps pinned to every available inch of wall space. In the center of the room sat a desk, and behind the desk sat a man who looked as though he had been carved out of the same dry parchment as the documents around him. He was dead, had been for some time, his head resting peacefully on an open ledger. Pendergast felt no shock, only a profound sense of recognition. This was the end of the line for so many of them, a quiet room, a stack of secrets, and a heart that finally decided it had carried enough. He began to search the room, not with the frantic energy of a novice, but with the patient, clinical precision of a man who had spent his life looking for the things people tried hardest to hide. He moved through the stacks of paper, his gloved fingers skimming over names he hadn't heard in years, men who had been legends in the corridors of the circus, women who had vanished into the maw of the Eastern Bloc, and operations that had been officially erased from the record. The cartographer, it seemed, had been the keeper of the unofficial record, the one who remembered the people the institutions had chosen to forget. As he worked, the light in the room began to fade, the shadows stretching across the floor like long, dark fingers. Pendergast found himself reading a series of letters, written in a delicate, sloping hand. They were love letters, or at least they started that way, but as he read further, he realized they were something else entirely. They were reports, disguised as the ramblings of a long-distance lover, detailing the movement of funds, the acquisition of assets, and the slow, steady infiltration of the city's infrastructure. The beloved was a code name for a cell leader, the longing was a request for instructions, and the kisses were the dates of scheduled drops. It was a masterpiece of tradecraft, a beautiful, tragic deception that had spanned decades. He sat in the dead man's chair, the ledger beneath him, and looked at the maps on the wall. They weren't maps of the city as it existed on the surface. They were maps of influence, of connections, of the invisible threads that bound one person to another. He saw lines connecting a bank in Zurich to a shipping company in Valparaiso, a political party in Rome to a labor union in Avellaneda. It was the big picture that his superiors were always talking about, but here, in this dusty room, it looked less like a grand strategy and more like a spider's web, fragile and intricate, and ultimately destined to be swept away. The phone on the desk rang, a sharp, jarring sound that cut through the silence like a knife. Pendergast froze, his heart hammering against his ribs. He let it ring once, twice, 3 times. On the 4th ring, he picked up the receiver but said nothing. He waited, listening to the static on the line, the distant ghost of a conversation. "Is the inventory complete?" a voice asked. It was a woman's voice, cool and professional, with the clipped tones of a Londoner who had spent too much time abroad. "The cartographer has retired," Pendergast said, his voice a mere whisper. There was a long pause on the other end. He could hear the faint sound of a siren in the distance, a reminder of the world outside this room. "I see. And the ledger?" "The ledger is here. But it's not what you think. It's not a list of enemies. It's a list of casualties. In our world, Pendergast, there is no difference," the woman said. "Bring it to the safe house in Recoleta. Tonight. At midnight. And don't be followed. The shadows in this city have eyes, and they are hungry." The line went dead. Pendergast replaced the receiver and looked at the dead man. He felt a sudden, inexplicable urge to apologize. He didn't know the man's real name, his history, or what he had sacrificed to build this library of ghosts. He only knew that they were the same, 2 aging men lost in a landscape of lies, waiting for a signal that would never come. He picked up the ledger, tucked it under his arm, and walked out of the apartment, leaving the dead man to his silence and his books. The night had turned colder, the rain shifting into a fine, stinging drizzle that blurred the lights of the city into long, shimmering streaks of neon. Pendergast walked toward Recoleta, his path taking him through the wide avenues and the manicured parks that defined the wealthier heart of Buenos Aires. Here, the decay was hidden behind high walls and iron gates, the rot replaced by a sterile, polished elegance. But Pendergast knew that the shadows here were just as deep, and far more dangerous. In San Telmo, the secrets were buried in the dust, in Recoleta, they were buried in the bloodlines. He stopped at a small plaza, the centerpiece of which was a statue of a forgotten general on a rearing horse. He sat on a damp bench and watched the shadows. He was looking for the telltale signs of a tale, the car that stayed 2 blocks behind, the man who stopped to tie his shoe every time Pendergast turned a corner, the subtle shift in the rhythm of the street. He saw nothing, which made him even more uneasy. A visible tale was a problem you could solve, an invisible one was a nightmare you had to endure. He felt the weight of the ledger against his side, a physical manifestation of the burden he had carried for 40 years. He thought about the woman on the phone. He recognized the voice now. It was Sarah Manning, a high-flying officer in the service who had been sent to the station 2 years ago to modernize the operations. She was young, ambitious, and possessed a ruthless efficiency that Pendergast found terrifying. To her, the agents were assets, the missions were data points, and the moral ambiguities were merely obstacles to be cleared. She was the new face of the circus, a world where the gray tones were being replaced by the stark blacks and whites of digital surveillance and drone strikes. Pendergast was a relic to her, a ghost from a war she had only read about in history books. He arrived at the safe house, a nondescript townhouse on a quiet, tree-lined street, exactly at midnight. The door opened before he could knock, and he was ushered into a dimly lit hallway by a young man with a buzz cut and a bulge under his jacket that suggested a sidearm. He was led into a study where Sarah Manning sat behind a glass-topped desk, her laptop glowing in the gloom. She looked up as he entered, her expression unreadable. "You're late, Arthur," she said, her voice devoid of emotion. "The streets are complicated," he replied, placing the ledger on the desk. "And the dead have a way of slowing a man down." She picked up the ledger and began to leaf through it, her eyes scanning the entries with a speed that felt like an insult to the years of work it represented. "This is it. A bunch of old names and outdated addresses. I was told the cartographer had the keys to the kingdom." "The kingdom is gone," Sarah, Pendergast said, sitting in a leather chair that felt far too comfortable. "These people aren't threats. They're survivors. They're the ones who were left behind when the wall came down and the ideologies shifted. They're living quiet lives, waiting for a world that no longer exists. They are loose ends," she snapped, closing the book with a sharp thud. "And loose ends are dangerous. Especially now. There's a new movement in the region, a resurgence of the old guards, and they're looking for these people. They want to use them, to harness their expertise and their connections. We can't let that happen. So what's the plan? We round them up. Eliminate them. We secure them. We bring them in, we debrief them, and we make sure they can't be used by anyone else. It's a cleanup operation, Arthur. Nothing more." Pendergast looked at her, and for a moment, he saw the entire history of the service reflected in her cold, blue eyes. It was the same old story, the pursuit of security at the expense of humanity, the belief that the end justified the means, no matter how petty the end or how brutal the means. He felt a sudden, sharp pang of regret. He should have burned the ledger in the apartment. He should have let the ghosts stay ghosts. "You don't understand," he said softly. "The cartographer didn't keep this list to protect them from us. He kept it to protect them from themselves. He knew that if they were ever found, their lives would be over, one way or another. He was their guardian, not their handler. And now he's dead," she said, leaning back in her chair. "And you're the one who brought us the list. You've done your job, Arthur. You can go back to London. We'll take it from here." Pendergast stood up, his bones aching, his spirit feeling heavier than ever. He walked to the door, but stopped before he left. "There's one name in there you should look at carefully. Page 42. A man named Miller. He was my partner in Berlin. He saved my life more times than I can count. He's 80 years old now. He has a small farm in the mountains. He just wants to grow his roses and forget the things he's done. Leave him alone, Sarah. For me." She didn't look up from her laptop. "I'll take it under advisement, Arthur. Good night." Pendergast walked out into the cool night air of Recoleta. He knew what "under advisement" meant. It meant that Miller would be the first one they visited. It meant that the roses would be trampled, and the old man would be dragged back into the light of an interrogation room. He felt a profound sense of failure, a realization that he had spent his entire life building a world that was now turning on him. He walked back toward the center of the city, his steps slow and rhythmic. He didn't go back to his hotel. Instead, he found himself walking toward the river, toward the dark, wide expanse of the Rio de la Plata. The city was quieter now, the pulse of the night slowing as the dawn approached. He stood at the edge of the water, watching the way the lights of the distant ships flickered on the horizon. He thought about the cartographer, and the dead man in the apartment, and the letters that were reports, and the reports that were love letters. He thought about the maps of influence and the webs of connection. He realized that the only way to truly escape the game was to become a shadow yourself, to disappear so completely that even the maps couldn't find you. He took his phone out of his pocket and looked at it, the direct line to the circus, the umbilical cord that tied him to the institution. He held it over the water for a long moment, feeling the weight of it, the potential of it. Then, with a sudden, fluid motion, he let it go. It hit the water with a soft splash and vanished. He walked away from the river, back into the heart of Buenos Aires. He didn't know where he was going, but for the first time in 40 years, he didn't have a plan, a mission, or a contact. He was just a man in a gray suit, walking through a city of ghosts. The rain had stopped, and the air was beginning to clear. In the distance, the first faint light of morning was beginning to touch the tops of the buildings, turning the gray to silver. Pendergast kept walking, his silhouette fading into the mist, until he was just another shadow in a city full of them, a man who had finally found the silence he had been seeking all along. The city began to wake, but it was a slow, groggy awakening. The bakeries began to smell of fresh bread and medialunas, the sweepers moved through the streets with their long brooms, and the first buses began their noisy rounds. Pendergast found a small plaza he hadn't seen before, a quiet square with an old fountain and a few stone benches. He sat down and watched the world come into focus. He felt a strange sense of peace, a lightness that he hadn't felt since he was a boy. He was no longer a player in the grand game. He was just an observer, a ghost watching the living. He thought of Miller and the farm in the mountains. He knew he couldn't save him, but he also knew that Miller would understand. They were both part of a generation that had lived by the sword and was now being told to die by the pen. There was a certain dignity in that, he supposed. A final, quiet surrender to the inevitable. As the sun rose higher, the shadows began to retreat, pulling back into the doorways and the alleys. Pendergast closed his eyes and felt the warmth of the sun on his face. He listened to the sound of the city, the chirping of the birds, the distant cry of a street vendor, the soft hum of life. It was a beautiful sound, a sound that had nothing to do with secrets or lies or missions. It was the sound of the world continuing, indifferent to the games men played in the dark. And so, he sat there, a man of gray thoughts in a city of vibrant colors, waiting for nothing in particular. He was finally home, not in a place, but in a state of mind. The silence was no longer a void, it was a sanctuary. He let his head rest against the back of the bench, his breathing slow and even, and as the city of Buenos Aires hummed around him, Arthur Pendergast finally closed his eyes and drifted into a sleep that was deep, quiet, and entirely his own. The morning light continued to climb the weathered walls of the surrounding buildings, illuminating the intricate ironwork of the balconies and the vibrant splashes of purple bougainvillea that spilled over the railings. Pendergast remained on his bench, a quiet fixture in the evolving scene. A stray dog, a scruffy terrier with a wise face, wandered into the plaza and sniffed at his shoes before curling up at his feet. Pendergast didn't move. He felt the warmth of the animal, a simple, unadorned presence that required no code words or double blinds. He began to notice the minute details he had previously overlooked, the way the light caught the ripples in the fountain's water, the specific shade of green of the moss growing between the paving stones, the rhythmic clicking of a woman's heels as she hurried to work. Each detail was a thread in a new kind of tapestry, one that wasn't designed to deceive or manipulate, but simply to exist. He realized that for his entire career, he had been looking for the why behind everything, the hidden motive, the secret agenda. Now, he was content with the is. Things simply were. In his mind, he began to dismantle the structures he had built over the years. He let go of the names of the safe houses in Prague, the frequency of the dead drops in Istanbul, the specific gait of the mole he had hunted for 3 years in the 70s. He let them all drift away, like leaves on a stream. They were heavy, cumbersome things, and he was tired of carrying them. He replaced them with the scent of the morning air, the feel of the sun on his hands, and the quiet companionship of the dog. He thought of the service, the circus, the great game. They seemed so small now, so inconspicuously petty. They were just children playing in the dark, convinced that their little squabbles were of monumental importance. But the world was vast, and the history of humanity was a long, winding road that didn't care about the borders drawn on maps or the secrets whispered in soundproof rooms. The true history was here, in the plaza, in the bread being baked, in the dog sleeping in the sun. As the hours passed, the plaza became more crowded. Children played near the fountain, their laughter ringing out like bells. Old men sat on the other benches, reading their newspapers and debating the merits of various football teams. Pendergast felt a sense of belonging that he had never experienced in the hallowed halls of Whitehall. He was one of them, a person with a history, a life, and a quiet corner of the world to call his own. He reached into his pocket and found a small, silver coin. It was a British pound, a relic from his life in London. He looked at it for a moment, the image of the Queen staring back at him with a stern, regal indifference. He walked over to the fountain and tossed the coin into the water. It sank quickly, joining the other coins at the bottom, a small sacrifice to the gods of chance and new beginnings. He walked out of the plaza, the dog following him for a few blocks before finding a more interesting scent and wandering off. Pendergast didn't mind. He wasn't looking for followers anymore. He walked toward a small cafe he had noticed earlier, one that didn't have gold leaf or yellow jackets, but instead had bright blue shutters and the smell of roasting coffee beans. He sat at a table outside and ordered a café con leche and a plate of medialunas. When the coffee arrived, it was hot, creamy, and sweet. He savored every sip, letting the warmth spread through his body. He watched the people of Buenos Aires go about their day, their faces full of the small, everyday concerns that made life worth living. He felt a profound sense of gratitude, for the sun, for the coffee, and for the fact that he was still here, still breathing, still capable of seeing the beauty in the mundane. He spent the rest of the day wandering through the city, not as an agent on a mission, but as a tourist in his own life. He visited the great library, with its winding staircases and its smell of old paper. He walked through the botanical gardens, marveled at the exotic plants and the quiet ponds. He sat in a small theater and watched a rehearsal for a tango performance, the dancers moving with a grace and a passion that felt like a rebuke to the sterile, cold world he had left behind. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the city, Pendergast found himself back at the river. The Rio de la Plata was a deep, bruised purple now, reflecting the colors of the sky. He stood on the promenade and watched the water, feeling the cool breeze off the river. He thought about the ledger and Sarah Manning. He knew that the world would continue to turn, that the games would continue to be played, and that new shadows would always replace the old ones. But he also knew that he was no longer a part of it. He had stepped out of the stream. He felt a deep, resonant sense of closure. The cartographer had been right, the map was not the territory. The true territory was the heart, and the soul, and the quiet moments of connection that could never be captured in a report or plotted on a chart. He was a man without a map, and for the first time in his life, he wasn't lost. He was exactly where he was supposed to be. The night returned to Buenos Aires, but it was a different kind of night. It was a night of stars and soft music and the gentle hum of a city at peace. Pendergast walked back to his modest hotel, his footsteps light on the pavement. He went to his room, undressed slowly, and lay down in the bed. The sheets were cool and crisp, and the pillow was soft. He listened to the sound of the city outside his window, the distant siren, the murmur of voices, the rustle of the leaves. He thought of the names in the ledger one last time. He whispered a silent goodbye to them all, to Miller, to the cartographer, to the man he had been in Berlin and London and a dozen other cities. He let them go, letting them drift into the dark. He closed his eyes and felt the weight of sleep pressing down on him, a gentle, welcoming hand. He didn't fight it. He embraced it, sinking into the velvet depths of a dreamless rest, a man who had finally found his way home, not to a country, but to himself. The silence of the room was absolute, a thick, comforting blanket that muffled the world. Pendergast's breathing slowed, matching the rhythm of the city's nocturnal heartbeat. He was no longer the man who watched, he was the man who was. And as the shadows of Calle, Florida stretched and yawned in the moonlight, Arthur Pendergast drifted away, lost in the quiet, beautiful vastness of the night. The transition from the cool, damp air of the Recoleta safe house back into the pulsating, nocturnal heart of Buenos Aires was a slow, almost medicinal process for Arthur Pendergast. He walked with a deliberate, rhythmic gait, his leather-soled shoes making a dry, rhythmic clack-clack on the uneven paving stones of the Avenida Alvear, a sound that seemed to anchor him to the physical world while his mind drifted backward through the decades. The city at this hour was a study in tonal shifts, the sharp, neon glare of a late-night pharmacy, the soft, buttery illumination of a sleeping hotel lobby, and the vast, velvet stretches of shadow between the street lamps. He felt the weight of the ledger he had left behind, not as a physical presence, but as a psychic residue, a lingering coldness on his ribs where the book had once rested. His hands, deep in the pockets of his gray overcoat, were still, his fingers occasionally brushing against a small, silver lighter he had carried since his days in the Bond station, a relic that had outlasted most of his contemporaries. As he moved southward, toward the older, more weary sectors of the city, the air began to thicken with the scent of wood smoke and damp earth, a combination that always triggered a specific, sharp memory of Berlin in the winter of '72. It was a memory that functioned like a recurring dream, one characterized by a profound, static silence and the perpetual smell of lignite coal. He remembered standing on the platform of the Friedrichstrasse station, the iron girders dripping with condensation, watching the S-Bahn trains hiss in and out of the east like ghost ships. He had been waiting for a man named Klaus, a low-level clerk in the Stasi's archival division who had promised a list of names that, even then, were already becoming shadows. The cold of that Berlin winter had been a sentient thing, a sharp, invasive pressure that settled into the marrow of the bones, much like the realization that he was being followed by his own side. Pendergast stopped at a newsstand that was being shuttered for the night, the sound of the corrugated metal rolling down a harsh, rhythmic rattle-clank that echoed down the street. He didn't buy anything, he simply watched the process, the way the vendor's hands moved with the practiced, unthinking efficiency of a man who had performed the same task 10,000 times. This was the essence of the trade as Pendergast understood it, the accumulation of repetitive, mundane actions that masked the slow, inexorable decay of the soul. He thought of Miller again, his old partner, whose name he had seen in the cartographer's ledger. Miller had always been the one to find the poetry in the mundane, the one who could look at a pile of discarded surveillance logs and see the tragedy of the lives they documented. He crossed into San Telmo, where the architecture became more skeletal, the shadows deeper and more complex. The cobblestones here were slick with a fine mist, reflecting the moonlight in a way that reminded him of the wet asphalt of the Glenick Bridge. He remembered the exchange, the long, agonizing walk across the center line, the way the wind whipped through his coat, and the sight of the man coming the other way, a Russian whose face was a mask of calculated indifference. They had passed each other without a word, 2 pawns being traded for 2 other pawns, while the kings and queens watched from the safety of their heated limousines. It was a world of transactions, of debits and credits, where the only thing that didn't have a price was the silence. The archive in the San Telmo apartment, the one where the cartographer had breathed his last, drew him back like a magnet. He found himself standing before the heavy, scarred wooden door once again, the silence of the hallway pressing in on his ears. He let himself in with the key he had pocketed, the lock turning with a soft, internal thud that felt like a secret being kept. Inside, the smell of old paper was even more pronounced, a dry, evocative scent that seemed to hold the echoes of 1,000 whispered conversations. He didn't turn on the main light, instead, he used a small, focused penlight, the beam a tiny, dancing circle that illuminated the spines of the books and the edges of the maps. He began to search the desk more thoroughly, his movements slow and methodical. He wasn't looking for a ledger this time, he was looking for the man behind the ledger. He found a small, wooden drawer hidden beneath the knee-hole of the desk, its contents a collection of seemingly random items, a rusted key, a faded photograph of a woman standing in front of the Brandenburg Gate, and a series of meticulously kept receipts for a small bookstore in London that had closed in the 80s. These were the fragments of a life, the small, inconsequential details that the service would have ignored, but which Pendergast recognized as the true coordinates of a man's identity. The woman in the photograph had a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, a look of profound, quiet endurance. Pendergast wondered if she was the beloved from the letters, the one whose longing was a code for instructions. He looked at her face for a long time, the tiny beam of his light tracing the contours of her features, until he felt a sudden, sharp pang of recognition. He had seen this woman before. Not in a photograph, but in a safe house in Vienna, 30 years ago. She had been a courier for the other side, a woman who had crossed the lines so many times that she had eventually lost track of where the lines were. He sat in the chair, the one where the cartographer had died, and closed his eyes. He allowed the atmosphere of the room to envelop him, the stillness and the scent of the past. He began to reconstruct the narrative, not the one Sarah Manning wanted, but the one that was true. The cartographer hadn't been a keeper of secrets for the service, he had been a keeper of secrets from the service. He had been building a sanctuary, a hidden world where the casualties of the Cold War could find a kind of peace, away from the endless cycles of betrayal and utility. The sounds of the city outside were a distant, muted hum, the occasional bark of a dog, the hiss of a passing car on the wet asphalt, the rhythmic drip of water from a leaky gutter. Drip. 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 It was a sound that marked the passage of a time that was no longer measured in missions or deadlines, but in the slow, steady accumulation of memory. Pendergast felt his own breathing slow, matching the rhythm of the room. He felt the tension in his shoulders begin to dissipate, replaced by a profound, heavy exhaustion. He thought of the walk back to his hotel, the long, winding path through the shadows of Buenos Aires. He knew that the morning would bring new challenges, that Sarah Manning would be waiting for her debrief, and that the game would continue its relentless progress. But for now, in this dusty room in San Telmo, he was safe. He was just a man sitting in a chair, surrounded by the ghosts of a war that had never ended, listening to the quiet, rhythmic pulse of a city that had seen it all and forgotten most of it. He allowed his mind to drift back to Berlin, to the snowy streets and the gray skies, to the sound of his own footsteps on the frozen ground. He remembered the feeling of being part of something larger, something that mattered, and the slow, painful realization that the something larger didn't care about him at all. It was a lesson he had learned many times, in many cities, but here, in the silence of the archive, it finally felt like a truth he could live with. He rose from the chair, his movements fluid and unhurried. He replaced the items in the hidden drawer, the rusted key and the faded photograph, and closed it with a soft, final click. He took one last look around the room, the tiny beam of his light catching the dust motes dancing in the air. He turned off the light and walked out of the apartment, the silence of the hallway closing in behind him like a curtain. The walk back to the hotel was a journey through a landscape of shifting shadows and muted colors. He moved with the same deliberate rhythm, his mind a blank slate, his senses attuned to the subtle changes in the air. He reached the Avenida de Mayo, the grand boulevard of the city, its wide sidewalks and ornate street lamps a stark contrast to the narrow, brooding streets of San Telmo. He walked past the closed cafes and the silent theaters, his silhouette a long, thin shadow stretching across the pavement. He reached his hotel, a modest, quiet establishment with a small, brass-railed elevator and a lobby that smelled of floor wax and old cigar smoke. He took the elevator to the third floor, the mechanical hum of the motor a soothing, familiar sound. He let himself into his room, a small, sparsely furnished space with a single window overlooking a courtyard. He didn't turn on the light, he simply stood by the window and watched the shadows move across the walls. He undressed slowly, each movement a ritual of divestment. He laid his gray suit over the back of a chair, placed his silver lighter on the bedside table, and climbed into the bed. The sheets were cool and smelled of lavender, a scent that felt like a benediction. He closed his eyes and listened to the sound of his own breathing, the slow, steady rhythm of a man who had finally found his way back to the silence. The world outside continued its slow, indifferent turning, but inside the small room, time had come to a standstill. Arthur Pendergast, the man of 1,000 lies and a single, heavy truth, allowed himself to sink into the deep, velvet embrace of the night. He was no longer a shadow in a city of ghosts, he was just a man, sleeping, while the ghosts watched over him with a quiet, mournful grace. The morning light would eventually find him, touching the silver lighter and the gray suit, but for now, there was only the stillness and the peace of a room that held no secrets. And as the city of Buenos Aires breathed in the dark, the echoes of the cold meridian finally faded into the silence of a long, restorative rest. The morning in Buenos Aires arrived not with a sudden burst of light, but as a gradual, systematic infiltration of gray, filtering through the heavy velvet curtains of Pendergast's hotel room like an unwelcome memory. He lay perfectly still in the narrow bed, his eyes fixed on a hairline crack in the ceiling plaster that resembled the coastline of some nameless, forgotten island. The transition from sleep to wakefulness was, for a man of his history, a slow and tactical movement, a reassembly of the persona, the tightening of the internal bolts before the world could begin its daily erosion of his resolve. He listened to the city waking up below, the rhythmic swish-swish of a street sweeper's broom, the distant, melodic cry of a vendor, and the low, percussive thrum of the morning traffic on the Avenida de Mayo. Each sound was a layer of reality being reapplied, a texture he had to navigate with the same caution he had used 40 years ago in the damp, claustrophobic corridors of the Bond station. He rose with a stiffness that was more than just physical, it was the weight of the previous night's discovery in San Telmo, the photograph of the woman with the enduring smile, and the realization that the past was not a closed file, but a living, breathing entity that had followed him across the Atlantic. He moved to the small wash basin, the porcelain cold and chipped under his touch. The water, when it finally ran hot, hissed and groaned through the ancient pipes, a sound that reminded him of the steam tunnels beneath the Reichstag where he had once huddled for 6 hours, listening to the boots of the Vopos echoing above his head. He shaved with a steady hand, the razor's edge a thin, silver line of clarity in the fog of his thoughts. He watched his reflection, the pale, watery eyes, the skin like translucent parchment, and wondered which of his many faces was the one currently looking back at him. By the time he reached the lobby, the humidity was already beginning to assert itself, a heavy, damp pressure that smelled of roasting coffee and exhaust. Sarah Manning was waiting for him in a corner booth of the hotel's breakfast room, her presence as sharp and incongruous as a shard of glass in a bowl of soft fruit. She was dressed in a crisp, charcoal-colored suit that seemed immune to the Argentine heat, her laptop open before her, the blue light of the screen reflecting in her eyes with a predatory brilliance. She did not look up as he approached, her fingers moving across the keyboard with a rapid, staccato rhythm that sounded like a distant telegraph. "You took your time, Arthur," she said, her voice a flat, administrative drone. "I've been reviewing the ledger entries you brought in last night. Most of them are useless, names of men who have been dead since the Falklands, addresses that are now shopping malls. But page 42, the one you mentioned. Miller. It's a live lead." Pendergast sat down slowly, the leather of the booth creaking under his weight. He ordered a black coffee from a waiter who moved with the glacial indifference of a man who had seen too many spies and not enough tourists. "Miller is a ghost, Sarah. He's an old man who wants to be left alone. There's no intelligence value in harassing him. Intelligence is not just about value, Arthur. It's about hygiene," she countered, finally looking up. Her gaze was clinical, devoid of empathy or malice. To her, Miller was not a human being with a history of sacrifice, but a data point that needed to be synchronized. "We cannot have unmonitored assets from the old regime floating around the southern cone. There's a movement growing in the provinces, nationalist elements, old guard hardliners, and they're looking for figures like Miller to lend them legitimacy. We need to secure him before they do." Pendergast felt a coldness settle in his stomach that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. He knew this vocabulary. Secure was a word that lived in the gray spaces between protection and elimination. He thought of the small farm in the mountains, the roses Miller had written about in his rare, coded letters, and the quiet, simple life the old man had built for himself after the wreckage of Berlin. "Berlin," Pendergast murmured, almost to himself. "What was that?" Manning asked, her pen hovering over a notepad. "The last time I saw Miller in the field was '79, Pendergast said, his voice dropping into a low, rhythmic cadence, the narrative unfolding like a slow-motion film. "We were in a safe house near the Tiergarten. The snow was so thick you couldn't see the other side of the street. We were waiting for a defector, a man who promised us the entire structure of the HVA's disinformation department. We waited for 3 days in a room that smelled of cabbage and wet wool. Miller told me then that the greatest betrayal isn't the one committed by the enemy, but the one committed by the institution you serve. He said the service is a machine that consumes its own parts to keep the gears turning." He watched Manning's expression, looking for a flicker of understanding, but her face remained a mask of professional boredom. To her, the Tiergarten was just a coordinate on a historical map, not a place where men lost their souls to the cold. "Miller was right," Pendergast continued, his eyes fixed on his coffee. "The defector never showed. Instead, we got a hit team from the 7th Directorate. Someone in London had sold the location. Miller took a bullet in the shoulder to get me out. He never complained. He never asked for a medal. He just went back to work, even though he knew he'd been betrayed by his own masters. And now, you want to secure him because he's a hygiene issue. The world has changed, Arthur, Manning said, her voice softening slightly, though the hardness remained in her eyes. We don't have the luxury of sentimentalizing the past. The service isn't a social club for retired agents, it's a security apparatus. If Miller is a liability, he has to be neutralized. Neutralized, Pendergast repeated, the word tasting like ash in his mouth. You use these words like they're antiseptic, Sarah. But there's nothing clean about what you're planning. You're going to destroy a man's peace because your spreadsheets have a gap in them. She closed her laptop with a definitive snap. I've authorized a team to move into the Córdoba province. They'll reach Miller's farm by nightfall. If you want to be useful, you'll provide the specific access codes he uses for his private comms. The cartographer's ledger hinted at a secondary channel. Pendergast looked at her, and for a moment, he saw the entire architecture of the service, the endless corridors, the soundproof rooms, the files that held the secrets of 1,000 broken lives. He realized then that he couldn't win this game by playing by her rules. He had to revert to the old ways, the ways of the shadows and the silences. I don't have the codes, he lied, his voice steady and devoid of inflection. The cartographer was thorough, but even he had limits. If Miller has a secondary channel, he's the only one who knows it. Manning studied him for a long moment, her eyes searching for the telltale flicker of a deception. Pendergast gave her nothing. He was a master of the blank space, a man who had spent his life becoming invisible. Finally, she nodded, a sharp, impatient movement. Fine. We'll do it the hard way. Stay in the hotel, Arthur. Your presence is no longer required in the field. I'll notify you when the operation is complete. She rose and walked out of the breakfast room, her heels clicking on the tile floor with a rhythmic, military precision. Pendergast sat alone, the silence of the room closing in around him. He felt a profound sense of isolation, a realization that he was now an enemy of the very institution he had served for 40 years. But he also felt a strange, flickering spark of purpose. He couldn't save the world, and he couldn't save the service, but he might, just might, be able to save Miller. He left the hotel, moving with a quiet, unhurried pace that masked the urgency in his mind. He didn't go back to San Telmo. Instead, he headed toward the Retiro station, the grand, Victorian railway terminus that served as the gateway to the north. The air inside the station was a chaotic symphony of sound, the screech of metal on metal, the hiss of steam, the echoing announcements, and the constant, rhythmic shuffle of thousands of feet. It was a place of transitions, of beginnings and endings, and Pendergast felt a kinship with its restless energy. He bought a ticket for a train to Rosario, a mid-sized city several hours to the north. It wasn't his final destination, but it was a start. He moved through the crowd, his gray coat a perfect camouflage in the sea of commuters. He boarded the train and found a seat in a quiet, half-empty carriage. As the train pulled out of the station, the city of Buenos Aires began to recede, the grand avenues giving way to the sprawling suburbs and then to the vast, flat expanse of the pampas. Pendergast leaned his head against the cool glass of the window and watched the landscape go by. The rhythmic clack-clack, clack-clack of the wheels on the tracks was a hypnotic, soothing sound, a pulse that seemed to synchronize with his own thoughts. He began to plan, not with the frantic energy of a novice, but with the patient, clinical precision of an old professional. He had 16 hours before Manning's team reached Miller. It was a narrow window, but in the world of espionage, a narrow window was often all you had. He thought of the secondary channel Manning had mentioned. He hadn't lied about not having the codes, but he did know how Miller thought. They had shared a language of silence for decades, a way of communicating through the gaps in the noise. He remembered a specific conversation they'd had in a rainy park in London, years ago. Miller had talked about the importance of the redundant frequency, a signal that everyone ignores because it seems like background noise. Pendergast reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, battery-operated shortwave radio he had picked up at the newsstand earlier. He put on a pair of thin earphones and began to scan the frequencies, his fingers moving the dial with agonizing slowness. He wasn't looking for a voice, he was looking for a pattern. He moved past the static, the music, the news reports, searching for the rhythmic blip-pause blip that Miller had always used as a signature. The train rattled on, the sun climbing higher in the sky, turning the green of the pampas into a brilliant, shimmering emerald. Pendergast sat in his seat, a man of gray thoughts in a world of vibrant colors, his entire being focused on the tiny, electronic pulse in his ears. He was a ghost chasing a ghost, a relic of a Cold War moving through a warm land, trying to find a way to break the architecture of betrayal before it could claim its final victim. The hours passed in a blur of motion and silence. Pendergast ate a dry sandwich he had bought at the station, the bread tasting like cardboard, but he barely noticed. His mind was in the mountains, in the small farm with the roses, imagining the moment when the hygiene team would arrive. He felt a sudden, sharp pang of regret for all the years he had spent serving the machine, for all the lives he had helped secure, or neutralize, in the name of the big picture. He realized now that the big picture was just a mosaic of small, individual tragedies, and that he had been one of the artists. The train arrived in Rosario in the late afternoon. Pendergast stepped onto the platform, the heat hitting him like a physical blow. He moved quickly through the station, his senses attuned to the rhythm of the city. He found a payphone in a quiet corner and dialed a number he had memorized decades ago, a number that didn't belong to the service, but to a private contact in the agricultural shipping business. The phone rang 4 times before a gruff, gravelly voice answered. "Diga." "The rain is a necessity for the garden," Pendergast said, the old code falling from his lips with a strange, heavy weight. There was a long pause on the other end. He could hear the faint sound of a television in the background, a football match being narrated with frantic energy. "Arthur? Is that you? I need a car, Jorge. And I need it now. Something nondescript, something that can handle the mountain roads. And I need a clear path to Córdoba. The mountains are dangerous at night, Arthur. The mist is thick, and the roads are narrow. I know the mist, Jorge. I've lived in it for 40 years. Just get me the car. Give me an hour. There's a garage near the docks. Ask for the blue Peugeot." Pendergast hung up the phone and walked out into the dusty streets of Rosario. He felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of clarity. For the first time in his life, he wasn't following orders. He wasn't part of a mission. He was simply a man trying to do the right thing, in a world where the right thing was often the most dangerous thing you could do. He spent the hour walking by the river, watching the brown water of the Parana flow toward the sea. He thought of the woman in the photograph, the one with the enduring smile, and wondered if she was still out there, somewhere in the shadows of Europe. He realized that they were all connected, the cartographer, Miller, the woman, and himself, all threads in a web that was finally beginning to unravel. He found the garage and the blue Peugeot. It was a battered, dusty vehicle that looked as though it had seen better days, but the engine hummed with a quiet, reliable strength. Pendergast climbed behind the wheel and began the long drive toward the mountains. The sun was setting now, casting long, purple shadows over the pampas, the sky a bruised mixture of orange and gold. As he drove, the architecture of betrayal began to feel less like a prison and more like a map. He knew the moves Manning would make, he knew the tactics her team would use, and he knew how to exploit the blind spots in their certainty. He was a relic, yes, but a relic who knew where the old tunnels were hidden. The road began to climb, the flat land giving way to the rolling foothills of the Sierras Chicas. The air grew cooler, the scent of the dry grass replaced by the smell of pine and stone. Pendergast pushed the Peugeot harder, the headlights cutting a path through the gathering gloom. He was moving toward the center of the spiral, toward the silence that waited at the heart of the game. He thought of Berlin one last time, the cold, the snow, and the look in Miller's eyes as they stood in the Tiergarten. He realized then that he wasn't just trying to save Miller, he was trying to save himself. He was trying to prove that, even after 40 years of lies, a man could still find his way back to the truth, if he was willing to walk through the shadows to get there. The night deepened, the stars emerging in the clear mountain sky like a million tiny, cold eyes. Pendergast drove on, his hands steady on the wheel, his heart beating with a slow, rhythmic purpose. The game was far from over, but for the first time, he was the one holding the deck. And as the blue Peugeot climbed higher into the silent peaks of Córdoba, Arthur Pendergast finally allowed himself to believe that the ghosts might, just this once, have the final word. Pendergast's battered blue Peugeot climbed the steep, jagged slopes of the Sierras Chicas, the muffled growl of the engine merging with the ancient, profound silence of the mountains. Here, the night was more honest than in Buenos Aires, harsher, colder, with stars like frozen needles piercing the indigo canopy. Arthur felt a slight tremor in his hands on the wheel. It wasn't fear, but the vibration of the final gear of a 40-year machine finally locking into place. Miller's farm was a low stone structure clinging to the side of a crag, looking as though it had grown out of the earth itself. Pendergast left the car a few hundred yards down the track, navigating the final approach on foot. His gait returned to that old, rhythmic tempo from the frozen sidewalks of Berlin, left-right, breathe, pause. The scent of pine needles and damp earth anchored him to the present, pulling him out of the gray corridors of memory. As he entered the garden, the moonlight cast a pale silver glaze over Miller's famous roses. Pendergast stood at the threshold. The door was unlocked, Miller never locked it. Inside, the air smelled of old books, brewed tea, and damp stone. "You're late, Arthur," a voice said from the darkness. Miller was sitting in a rocking chair by the cold fireplace. A blanket lay across his knees, and in his hand was an old Mauser, uncocked. His face had lost the sharp edges of 40 years ago, replaced by deep furrows and the soft contours of a man who had made peace with his ghosts. "Manning's team is on the way, Miller. They'll be here before dawn," Pendergast said, his voice a whisper that respected the room's stillness. Miller smiled weakly. "Manning, the new breed. They think the world is a chessboard. They don't realize it's just a collection of footprints we leave behind. They're coming to secure me, aren't they? They're coming to erase you. Your memory, your files, and every secret you've kept." Pendergast noticed the small radio on the corner table. The rhythmic signal he had followed was still pulsing there, a tiny, electronic heartbeat. Miller hadn't been broadcasting a distress call, he had been sending a funeral rite. "We have to go," Pendergast said. "I know an old track to the Chilean border. Jorge's people will meet us. From there, to the Pacific, and then to a place where we can fall off the map entirely." Miller stood up with effort, his movements slow but deliberate. Falling off the map, that was the cartographer's dream. We were never part of the map, Arthur. We were only the ink used to draw it. And ink eventually dries. They stepped out into the night. As they passed through the roses, a faint, rhythmic hum echoed from the valley below. Manning's hygiene team was approaching. Their darkened jeeps climbed the mountain like predators scenting prey. Pendergast eased Miller into the Peugeot. He didn't start the engine. He put the car in neutral, letting it roll silently down the incline by gravity alone. The soft crunch of gravel under the tires was the only sound. They glided like a shadow past the approaching headlights, hidden by the thick mountain mist and the deep, accommodating darkness. They reached the highway as the first hint of gray touched the eastern horizon. Pendergast finally turned the key, the engine sparking to life with a quiet, reliable thrum. He looked at Miller, who was watching the mountains recede in the rearview mirror. "What happens now, Arthur?" Miller asked softly. "The silence happens," Pendergast replied, his voice steady. "We go where the files don't reach. We become the blank spaces." As the sun began to rise over the pampas, painting the world in shades of pale amber and gold, the blue Peugeot disappeared into the vast, open distance. The architecture of betrayal was left behind, a crumbling ruin in a city of ghosts. Arthur Pendergast, the man of 1,000 lies, finally stopped counting the minutes. He simply drove, his eyes fixed on the horizon, moving toward the only meridian that mattered, the one where the secrets end and the rest begins.